So while we are waiting for our guests to join us from the waiting room, we know there's always a few people who are a few minutes late, but I'll just start off by introducing the day and saying thank you very much to all of you for joining us today, and particularly to our wonderful panel of speakers. We're very honoured that you've taken time out of what we know is a very stressful period to join us for this event marking Women's Day today. And particularly here in London, where the sun is shining. We know that's always a big pull factor because we so rarely see it, that as soon as we see the skies going blue, everyone rushes out. So well done for sticking with us. Just to introduce myself, my name is Shireen John, and I'm in the communications team at the London International Development Centre. I know that a lot of you will know about LIDC already and what we do. Just to say a few words for those of you who don't, we were founded in 2007 by a number of Bloomsbury colleges who wanted to bring people together to work across disciplines to try and solve some of the seemingly intractable problems in the global development landscape. Since then, we have been joined by a number of other higher education institutions, as well as a number of NGOs, a lot of the names that you will recognise, SOAS, London School of Hygiene, WaterAid, Oxfam, Quam, Doctors with Africa, various charities. So you can find out more about who the membership organisations are on our website, lidc.ac.uk. And the reason I say that is because membership of LIDC is free and open to anyone who is or has been in one of our member institutions. So if you studied at Birkbeck Geography Department in 1978, you can still sign up for free membership. And if you go on our website, you'll find out what else we do, podcasts, events, all that sort of thing. Training, we do a lot of training. If you don't want to sign up for membership, which now anyone can, if you're not in a member institution, there's a very tiny fee that you'll have to pay to help us with running costs. But if you don't even want to do that, you can just sign up to our newsletter so that you get informed of regular news and updates in the global development landscape. A bit about today, I will shortly hand you over to our moderator, Dr. Colleen Powell, who has very kindly agreed to come along and moderate today's event. Before I do that, just a reminder that we are encouraging people to live tweet. We will be putting relevant Twitter handles in the chat, and we are encouraging people to ask questions as well. Please put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat box, because we tend not to look in the chat box for questions. We look in the Q&A. So a word about our moderator. Dr. Colleen Powell is a lecturer in education and international development with the Centre for Education and International Development at UCL's Faculty for Education and Society, formerly known as the IOE. She's a module leader for the Gender, Education and Development module for the Master's Programs in Education and International Development, and has been extensively involved over the last 20 years in research and policy work around issues of equity and diversity in education and in the building of inclusive societies, particularly in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. She has lectured and published on these issues, and she's also contributed to a number of national policy initiatives in South Africa. Between 1998 and 2014, Colleen worked at the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa, initially as a researcher for their Centre for the Study of Higher Education, and then as Director, Institutional Research in the Vice Chancellor's Office. I hope I've got that correct. Since joining UCL in 2017, in addition to a full teaching workload, they do say if you want something done, ask a busy woman. She has been involved in a number of large research projects. More recently, she's been involved in a large systematic review for UNESCO and has researched the gendered effects of the extended school closures that have taken place during the pandemic. So with no further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand you over to Dr. Colleen Powell. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shireen, and welcome everybody to this very interesting and important webinar, Gender and Power. And what we really wanted to do was use this opportunity to celebrate International Women's Day by hearing from people involved in projects around the world, across different parts of the globe, around addressing gender inequalities, particularly through the empowerment of women. So I'm not going to spend any more time. I'm going to introduce you to the first speaker, and each speaker will have a bit of time for each person to speak and talk about what they're doing, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. And as Shireen said, please put your questions in the Q&A. So I'd like to first introduce you to Menaka Rao, who's an award-winning journalist with more than 15 years experience. She's reported extensively on health, nutrition, and justice through the lens of gender rights, children's rights, and the right to food. She's written for the BBC, The Guardian, Health Policy Watch, and other Indian publications. She's now a consulting editor with a podcasting platform, Suno India. And I think Menaka is coming to us directly from India. So over to you.
Thank you so much. As Dr. Colleen said, I've been working as a health journalist for a while, for about 15 years or so. And for the past maybe 5-10 years, I've been consciously writing on gender, and it's a very conscious sort of attempt because, it doesn't come very easily. And for this particular, right now I want to talk about something that seems very basic, just talking to women and girls and how hard it is to get them to talk. Because what has always surprised me that at least in my context, in the Indian context, many women I interview, they feel that they don't have anything worthwhile to say. Okay, and by this I mean women who are often poor and vulnerable. They're dependent on their husbands or families. Some of them are abandoned, but it also could include privileged women who just live in a shadow of their husbands and fathers, just a typical patriarchal setup. So what often happens is that, it's very, I wanted to talk about this because, when we talk about research, how difficult it is to break through this barrier, of generally getting to know women, right? So it's very common when you go to someone's house and, you talk to the woman and, the man will answer your question. And or even when the subject of what I'm trying to ask them is the woman herself, or maybe it involves a child, where the woman is the primary caregiver. But even then the man will answer. And from what I understand is that the pretext is often that women do not concern themselves with the outside world. And I'm talking, of course, about my context, the Indian context, and referring to, of course, it doesn't mean all women, but it's referring to quite a few women. And I write on health, right? And the outside world is this world of doctors and hospitals and prescriptions and official subject matter, government schemes, and things that women they feel that they cannot represent that aspect of their lives, right? The man has to do it for them. And the assumption also is that the events that transpire in the household, how they live their lives, is not interest to people like me. It's an assumption, but I am interested in them, right? And if I want to ask them about their illness, the husbands or the parents, or in case of girl children, the parents will rattle off their symptoms and talk on their behalf. So I'll give you a few examples. There are many, but I was working on this podcast series related for on tuberculosis called Gasping for Breath, and covers a range of issues. And wherever I traveled, I would ask my sources, to help me, cover some sort of gender angle, even though I was looking at other angles. And, I met these two sisters, 14 and 17 years old. And, they're from Bihar. It's a poor state in India. And both had TB. And I was talking with them in a room with their parents and grandparents. And I would ask them things like, what are your hobbies or what they like to do? Because I want to write about their lives, not just, I just don't want to tick boxes, patient check, medicine check, they take their medicines check, they have recovered from TB check, I don't want to do that, right? So I want to talk about their lives and how a certain event has affected them, or, but not just about the event, but about them. And, how maybe, them going to school has been affected, or, maybe their friends don't talk to them, etc. Right? But whenever I asked them anything, their parents would answer. It was very hard to get, my any word in, right? And even if I asked them anything, they would just say one or two words here and there. And then, I later realized that, they were not even allowed to get out of the house, or, even to the market. They could just go to school and come back, right? So, and I obviously, in that context, I was not able to get to know them. And, these are now, okay, these are younger girls. So you can see, okay, they are, they're with their parents. Then I met this woman called Indu Paswan, and, she had undergone a hysterectomy at the age of 25. And this was basically, the story was that it was a government scheme. It's a government insurance scheme. Under which what happened is that many private doctors, they conducted what was later qualified to be unnecessary hysterectomy. So the doctors were basically, if a woman goes, with some sort of abdominal problem, and they would just say that, you need to undergo hysterectomy, and then they would basically get the money from the insurance scheme. So when I was went to a house, and it was obviously like in a very far off village, and, first thing, and it's not like I had her number or something, so I couldn't like come. I just like went there. So she said, my husband is not at home. So I told her, no, but I want to talk to you. So then I asked her that why did she agree to this surgery? And she said that she also looked puzzled, and she said, but my guardian, she agreed to it. And this woman is like, she has 2 children. She's 25. So I said, who is your guardian? So then she said that she pointed to her mother-in-law and said, mother-in-law had accompanied her for the surgery, and she just agreed. The husband and she talked to each other over a phone call, and they just agreed to do this, right? And this mother-in-law was hovering in the background while I was talking to her. And she did not clearly want to talk in front of her. And, she told me that, in very few words that, she was weak and she was not able to work much. And, this is like less than a minute of conversation, right? And this is a big deal in a rural setup where, a woman's labor, which is invisible, of course, but it's very important for her to prove her worth in the household through this labor. And a sick woman has then very little status in the house, like I would say no status, right? So they are draining the resources of the household, and they can be abandoned anytime. And that someone is taking care of you when you're sick is a big deal, like however it is. So as I said, the mother-in-law is hovering, and this is again a common feature. Women are often looking over their shoulder to see, okay, who is watching me while I'm talking to a reporter. And, like this happened to me once in Bombay, where this woman I was talking to, and there was this man right outside her house, and I didn't pay much attention to it. And then she said, I can't talk much because this man is my brother-in-law and he's watching what I'm saying. And what she probably wanted to tell me was that her husband she didn't want to live with her husband, basically. And she wanted to leave him, but, she can't talk, basically. And that is something I filled. That information was filled in like over a period of time. But, and sometimes, we are not even asking women the right question. Again, like there was a flood in 2016 in Bihar. It's a state there in India. It's a poor state again. And, I just happened to go to this government camp sort of place, where these people are just waiting outside on the main road. It's a transit sort of camp, and it's barely anything actually. And they're just waiting for the water to recede in their villages. And I happened to come during lunchtime, and I realized that there is not a single woman waiting in the lunch line. Basically, a school, the government was providing lunch in the school. And I asked the women, and they were like, "What are you even asking us? We can't sit with the men and eat." And I realized that if I had not reached at that time, I would never ask them that question that, how are you getting your meals? And nobody thought it was a strange situation. So I edit other people's work now, and I often tell people that, get more women's voices in, like just try very hard. And people always tell me, reporters tell me that, I tried, and, these women are not articulate enough, there's not much to say. And, I can't, how many, what can I write? But, as hard as that is, it's important to get these voices in and, try get the trust of this person you're writing about, because we want them to represent more than what you're trying to represent them in the stories. We want to know about that person, and only that more things about their life will make them more human in the story, right, for us. So like sometimes you have to spend hours sitting with them, like often in uncomfortable silence, trying to have a chat with them. And what do you like to do, what is your day like, how do you like to spend your free time, just to get some glimpse in their life, and some, like, out of some 15 questions, one may click. But basically trying to show active interest in women, and who are not used to advocating for themselves or talking about themselves like their lives are important. And having said that, I don't think that any of us succeed each time. Like like we may get through to one woman, may not get through to many, right? And in this the context is that half the women in my country do not have their own cell phones. Okay, this was revealed in a nationwide survey recently, and a National Family Health Survey, and 1/3 of women surveyed actually said that they experience spousal violence. When I read these surveys, I'm like, how did a woman who was just asked a question in a survey actually answer your question? Because that's not been my experience, right? So which means that if they actually answered, which means imagine how much is underreported. Yeah, but there is one group of women I reported on, who are, even though they are they're from the rural areas, they're from conservative families and may not be that educated, but they have a very strong voice. So we have a troupe of community health workers called Asha workers in India. And, what they do is they go home to home, find out about people's health issues, direct them to the right government facility. They help pregnant women get antenatal checkups. They help in the vaccination program, like, get the community together so that, the children get vaccinations on time. So, recently I chat, they're often my interlocutors when I go and, go to a village. Recently, I realized that, when I was chatting with them in March 2020, just when COVID, the pandemic struck basically. And, they were just going home to home, checking symptoms, etc. And, what was interesting is I did not even have to meet them. A phone call, and, they could talk for hours about themselves. And, it's not like their lives are not without problems, but what was interesting is that if they're given an opportunity to help, to basically work and, and represent their community, they can advocate for themselves. So, what I want to say about what I want to eventually say is that, as hard as it is, we want, when we write about women, we want them to be more than just stick figures, and, try to get through to them. And, and it's completely worth our while to try hard and get through to women and write about them as complete human people rather than, just as representing something.
Okay, thank you so much, Menaka. I think it was so important to hear some of those stories, because those are women's experiences, and they're really important. So thanks so much. I'm now going to ask Dr. Romina Istratii, who's our next speaker. Dr. Istratii is a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow at the School of History, Religions, Philosophies and Honorary Research Associate to the Department of Development Studies and the Center of World Christianity at SOAS. Romina is based in East Africa and funded by the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship. She's working on a project, Bridge, which is a research and innovation project dedicated to the development and strengthening of religio-culturally sensitive domestic violence alleviation systems in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the UK. Project Bridge aims to bridge different disciplines, sectors, and stakeholders in order to achieve a more reflexive, decolonial, and integrated approach to domestic violence, and works in diverse religious communities. So over to Dr. Istratii.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for the introduction. I'm going to jump straight into the presentation. I have a few slides while I speak, and I'm going to close my camera because I'm connecting from Ethiopia, and I have an unstable connection, so apologies for that. So my title today is regards the role of religious traditions in promoting gender equality and responding to domestic violence, building on the case study of Project DLDL. So DLDL is the name of the project I'm blessed to be leading in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the UK, and it means bridge in Tigrigna language. So I kind of want to build on some of the insights, the evidence that we've built in this project to respond to this question. Why is it important to engage religio-cultural parameters in responding to gender inequalities? Oftentimes, and I come from, so just a bit of context, I have about a decade now working to kind of decolonize, if I may use this term, international development from Western assumptions and theorizations and definitions, because unfortunately the international development sector has been very much dominated by, you know, Western knowledge, really. And I think that that happens in multiple other disciplines and sectors. And it has happened also in religious studies. So I'm based in religious gender and development studies at that intersection. When it comes to religion itself, I think a lot of people think of it as a problem when it comes to gender inequalities and domestic violence and women's abuse and girls' abuse. And I think to some extent this holds true, depending on how that one understands that statement. But I think it's also a generalization and unfair representation, because it's very much influenced by Western society's experience with religion and the rigid definition that religion has within our Western epistemology and understanding, right? Religion itself as a concept emerged in the 19th century, again, within Western discourse. And, you know, since then, anthropologists, ethnographers, philologists, all sorts of people try to define religion based on how they understood it, depending on the stage of Western development they were experiencing, right? So obviously there were enlightenment struggles to kind of liberate the mind from theology and secularism and so on. And so religion was defined in multiple ways, but always, for some reason, Western Christianity was kind of viewed as the superior faith and kind of the point of reference. So everything, all comparisons with other religious traditions were done vis-a-vis Western Christianity. So there are hidden biases there, again, because again, the way religion has been defined is very much influenced by these societies' experience with religion. There has been also a lot of people might be familiar with that, a gender-sensitive critique of religion, especially biblical traditions, and how they have kind of constructed women within their representations. And they're kind of trying to revisit these socially embedded and socially constructed religious discourses that are hostile to women, to kind of rebuild, you know, religious understandings of women and girls and gender relations in general. And this is very valuable in terms of feminist contributions to religious studies. But unfortunately, again, because of the dominance of Western perspectives in global knowledge production, oftentimes this feminist hermeneutics of suspicion, as it has been called by Fiorenza, a German theologian, oftentimes dominates. And so all religious traditions then are kind of presented as sexist, patriarchal, or complicit, almost by default, because that theory is being applied or assumed. And again, I don't want to come to be misunderstood. Religious traditions, as I will discuss, are part of the problematic system, but also we need to understand that the epistemological dominance of Western knowledge has also defined how we view these concepts as well, and that these concepts might not actually reflect universal truths. So actually, as a religious ethnographer, I've been kind of researching and describing, people's experiences with religion and gender issues. I would say that there isn't a religion per se, again, because this is a very West-centric concept. For instance, in Ethiopia, people might use in Amharic the term Haymanot, which means something very different than what religion encapsulates as a concept, okay? What I would like to say is that there are context-specific religio-cultural belief systems, okay? And it's important that we differentiate between theological, dogmatic, kind of doctrinal tenets and the lived experience of the clergy and the laity, but without separating the two, because obviously they influence each other. One of them might be a bit more complicit to the problems, but also the other, let's say, theological teachings could become resourceful in some ways. And I would say one might want to speak of religio-cultural belief systems and frameworks, all right, that are context-specific and developed historically. So it's very hard to generalize. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition has very little to similarity with the Eastern Orthodox tradition, although the theology has some, shared foundations. The Islamic tradition in some Middle Eastern countries is very different than the Islamic tradition seen, let's say, in Senegal. So, one has to account for that context. And the important thing that I want to bring out is that in general, I have worked in multiple countries of the African region and the Eastern European and Southern European region. And generally, people will tend to differentiate between faith and culture, but in reality, these are intermixed, right? And the way people differentiate or not between faith and culture will determine how they respond to social norms and how open they are to challenge some accepted gender standards and practices, right? If they identify, if they value their faith and religious tradition, and they identify what they do in everyday life and the gender standards they follow with their faith, they might be hesitant to depart from those because it might mean that they depart from their valued faith. But if they think that it's actually the practice is more habit or tradition, as opposed to theological teaching, then people might be more willing to openly challenge those. And this was reinforced by my own anthropological long-term research in Ethiopia, which again show that it's a very nuanced picture. Faith oftentimes, again, religious discourse, because it's part of the cultural fabric, it is sometimes complicit in perpetuating gender asymmetries. But at the same time, it's valued by the people, and women in particular who were dealing with difficult husbands or abusive situations were using it as a coping mechanism and kind of resorting to faith to make sense of what couldn't be made sense of, right? And men, some men, again, there was an idea that men are not religious, but actually a lot of men I spoke to wanted to be righteous and condemned being sinful. And so they were choosing not to be abusive because of this influence, the religious conscience. And finally, clergy, again, in many rural communities, we might think that clergy, clergy mediate and they provide advice and pastoral support and so on to their spiritual children and communities and faith communities. And oftentimes they make things worse, right? Because they don't understand the complex psychology of victims and perpetrators and how to respond with safeguarding concerns in mind, not to minimize the risk essentially for the victims. But at the same time, they try their best, and sometimes they're the only resource that works locally. And so they shouldn't be neglected because they are already involved in the system, right? It would be very difficult to find solutions by ignoring them. And so the argument that I'm making and that this project is built on is that it's important to understand religious traditions from the community's own point of view and how these shape their own identities, attitudes, and behaviors. And because oftentimes religious traditions are so important to people and how they understand their lives and worldviews, they can't be dismissed, especially if we want to be culture sensitive. What does culture sensitive mean in a religious context? Well, we have to account for all these parameters that are important to people. And it's also important to understand that in different contexts, the religious aspect will intertwine with gender realities in different configurations. So in some traditions, religious discourse provides more entry points, I guess, for misuse or misinterpretation. In some other contexts, it might be used differently in a more, kind of resourceful way. So it really depends by context and how people have been exposed to that religious tradition. So it's important to look at context. And again, it's important to try and understand what the religious teaching might say and how that is understood, and then the culture-specific gender practices in the people's own vernacular practice, everyday practice, in order to understand how that religious influence might become resourceful. It might be part of the problem today, but it could become resourceful tomorrow. So Project DLDL is actually a project that aims to translate the evidence that we have collected previously and built previously within in Ethiopia and other African countries as well, and try to kind of promote more culture sensitive, religious informed approaches to domestic violence in tradition oriented religious communities. So we work in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the UK. It's a project that aims to not only build evidence and then apply that evidence to create and design practical interventions. And again, those practical interventions instead, try to build on existing infrastructures in the countries we work in. They're not adding, they don't exist in silos. They aim to add value in existing systems and domestic violence response alleviation mechanisms. And it also aims to employ a decolonial approach. So that means that we truly start from the understandings of the communities, aiming to use reflexive ethnographic participatory research methodologies. And then we aim to work, and again, have tried and truly being committed to working through partnerships for all the components of this project, whether it's research, intervention, or knowledge exchange. We work with multiple partners in Ethiopia and Eritrea, academic, feminist organizations, faith-based organizations, universities, and any other actor involved in responding to domestic violence in this context. And we look to add value to what they're already doing, as opposed to trying to, tell people how things should be done. That's not what we do. We try to share evidence that they might not have the capacity or the time to produce, and then it is upon them to decide how that evidence should be used for their benefits. And as I said, the name means bridge. And what we aim ultimately to do is, again, as you may know, a lot of you existing in different sectors, there's a lot of preconceptions, generalizations, and as I discussed, ideological agendas between the different sectors that respond to domestic violence. And these kind of lack of understandings or generalizations oftentimes do not let us work constructively with each other. And I see that, the feminist organizations that we may be speaking with might see religion as a more problematic aspect, right, of the equation. The faith-based organizations we work with actually think that religion is resourceful and the solution. So it's really important that we create a bridge to bring all these stakeholders together, to understand that we're actually trying to work towards the same aim oftentimes, but because we lack understanding of each other and each other's approach and why we choose these approaches, we can't really build integrated constructive partnerships, right, and approaches. And I just wanted to, the last slide, apologies, Colleen, just to bring out some of the effects of a series of workshops that we are currently delivering with the Ethiopian Orthodox Diet of Clergy here in Ethiopia. I'm actually one of the trainers, so this is something I know very well, and I speak from experience. And we've already trained 155 clergy on domestic violence to build their preparedness. And our training comprises of, domestic violence, a unit on domestic violence and how that is experienced in community, the role of the clergy, how sometimes they are problematic or part of the problem. The second is theological. We give them theological training to respond to misuses or abuses of religious discourse. And the third one is on the legal framework and safeguarding rules, and approaches to respect the confidentiality of the victim and, prioritize the victim's safety. And I just wanted to read 2 or 3 of those, if that's okay, just to show you
Romina, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to end because we've gone over time. Sorry.
No worries. If I could just say, ultimately, people can read that, so that's not important. But I did want to say that it proves that, clergy do want to learn actually, and they are willing to be influenced by this kind of trainings. And I think it proves that, they can become a resource that we shouldn't ignore in this struggle for equality and women's well-being. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Romina, and sorry that we had to, because it was really, really interesting. And I think it just also highlights how important it is to understand issues of gender inequality and gendered relations in context and to make meaning of them in context. So thank you so much. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Lucia Kula, who's an international human rights lawyer and a lecturer in law and gender at SOAS, where she obtained her LLM and her PhD. Her research adopts an interdisciplinary approach to law, irregular migration, borders, and gendered violence. She's a former refugee from Angola and writes on law and forced displacement issues and identity in the African diaspora, with a focus on critically analyzing the experiences of women and other marginalized communities. She leads the Decolonizing the Academy group within SOAS and other higher education institutions in the UK. So over to Lucia.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you for having me. When I was asked to contribute to this event, I had to think very hard of what I wanted to talk about, particularly what I wanted to focus on. There is a lot that I would love to share, but as my introduction was shared with you, I am a former refugee from Angola. I grew up partially in the Netherlands, and this has shaped significantly my understanding of how, as a woman, as a refugee, I was able to navigate certain spaces, which is also what has informed my research and what I have been contributing to for the past few years, particularly at SOAS. So focusing on decolonizing work, particularly on the ideas of law being decolonized, but also the academic space being decolonized. But within the context of my own research, particularly my PhD, I focused on the experiences of Congolese women in Angola and the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also the ideas around identity and how we move borders, how we navigate border spaces and borderlands. The reason why I decided to focus on this particular narrative was, of course, through my own experiences growing up as a refugee, coming from a conflict country and being displaced, living in exile in a European country with very little context to how that would shape my identity initially. So my research focused particularly on understanding how women's lives are often left out of the conversation when we talk about law, and particularly around how law can be inherently violent. We never really consider the ideas of how law means, the means to offer protection to all, and also the idea that we are all perceived to be equal in law, but law is inherently violent, particularly in the context of how international law has been shaped, and how we often ignore geographical bias. And I think maybe with the current discussions around Ukraine and refugees, we have seen a little bit more context on what we mean where law can be inherently violent. So my research in Angola and the DRC, particularly on the southern border of the DRC and the northern borders of Angola, focused on how refugee women, and particularly the irregular migrant women, cross the borders between the two countries, how it shaped their narrative around identity, and how they created liminal spaces of belonging, how they built communities around this idea of identity that was not only constructed, but also shaped around borders that were created, and therefore also created separations around communities that in previous times were connected and had a link to each other. So when women are fleeing violent spaces and are fleeing conflict, what does that say around their opportunities to create community and to care for each other? What does border create when it is the site of violence? What is the ambiguity of identities at the border when we have to be considerate of who is able to cross the border? We've seen some of these discussions, particularly with regards to African refugees in Ukraine trying to cross the border into neighboring countries as well. So within the context of Congolese women, we also had to ask questions around how is law then inherently violent because it doesn't offer enough protection to them? And what do refugee women, particularly Congolese women in that geographical setting, consider as justice? What do women want before justice? What is considered as an appropriate response to challenging the conditions in law currently? So where law doesn't offer enough protection, particularly when it comes to the impunity of actions of state actors, non-state actors, and even humanitarian actors. We've seen reports of organizations such as Oxfam, World Health Organization, UN peacekeepers, etc., contributing to the violence that happens in the Congo, particularly violence that happens to women. So what is then left for Congolese women to do? How do Congolese women tell their stories to not be seen merely as victims? From the early 2000s on to, let's say, the mid 2015s, most of the conversation, most of the narratives that was coming out of the Democratic Republic of Congo was that all women were subjected to violence, particularly sexual violence. All women were portrayed as being victims. So when you take away that agency for women, when you take away that aspect of identity for women, what is then left for Congolese women to want or to ask? What is meant around identity, but also justice? What does justice mean for them? What are the considerations that we're asking or that we're making, particularly when donor organizations are involved in the country? The contributions that are made on projects that particularly focus on the violence that women experience also means then that women's stories, and I think this ties in really well with what Menaka was sharing around what women are willing to talk about, what women are let to talk about. So women's stories are then shaped around what is perceived to be more beneficial in that context. So when donor organizations are particularly funding projects or initiatives that are focusing on violence for women or violence committed against women, the narrative continues that all women in Congo are raped, all women in the Congo are subjected to sexual violence, and funding is then put into these projects. And then the women who are maybe not subjected to sexual violence or maybe do not want to center that aspect in their identity are left out of the conversations. Women's agency is taken away, but also the considerations that we make around how justice looks like for women is taken away, because we consider creating agency is letting women speak and letting women speak on their own terms about the experiences that they've had. But particularly in law, and this is where my research focuses, particularly in law, women's lives are not taken into consideration. Law is shaped around the ideas of men, and that men also occupy most of that space. So the lived experiences, particularly around when it comes to conflict, when it comes to violence, when it comes to gendered narratives, is often forgotten. Intersectionality plays a significant part of that, but also decolonizing our idea of what law is meant to do or what law is offering in this context. So when I talk about the experiences of Congolese women, and also in the context of my own experience of growing up as a refugee, I always wonder what the expectation is for women in these spaces. What is the expectation that we have of Congolese women? Are they supposed to forever talk about the violence they experience? Is there more beyond that identity that adds to their agency, that adds to the narrative or the conversations that we need to have, particularly around the geographical bias where law is concerned? Who does law offer protection to? And how do we have conversations around these spaces? How do we have conversations around the inherent bias and even sometimes racism that is presented when we cross borders? We've seen some of the considerations made around the border crossing of Ukrainian national versus African or other irregular migrants crossing the border. And we have to ask ourselves, do we make the same considerations when we're looking at women or children that don't particularly look like us? And that is where we then ask questions: how do lived experience contribute to our narrative? How do lived experience add value to understanding not only the geographical context, but also where law is failing? So when I ask myself what I want to see law develop into in the wider context, I hope to be able to be in a space where we're not only challenging how we view law, but we're also actually challenging the stories that are told within law. Law in itself doesn't lend it to be a tool where stories, lived experiences are particularly valued. And this is a space where it needs to be valued. This is a space where context, where narrative, where positionality is an inherent element of how we shape laws that actually offer protections to all equally, which is not currently the case. So when it comes to understanding where we can shape not only our ideas where women's lives are concerned, but particularly where women's lives where violence is concerned, maybe our understanding needs to shift away, even now still, from the ideas of talking about victims rather than including the lived experience and the stories of women as agents, but also women as their own storytellers, women that have something to add to the scholarship. I became an international human rights lawyer through my own experiences, but I wanted to research law, particularly because of my lived experiences. I wanted to add that autoethnographic context in my research and tell the story of law through my experience and how that has contributed to me at some point ending up in London. So law in itself is a tool that can be used as liberating tool, but it can also be an inherently violent space. And when we talk about gendered power and we talk about the experiences of women, these are some of the considerations that we have to make. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much. I think it was really, really important. And when thinking about the, that legal space is such an important one. So thanks so much for that. Sorry, that was my Okay, so our last speaker today is Elaine Fletcher, and she's editor-in-chief of Health Policy Watch, which is a global health non-profit news agency that's based in Geneva, with an extensive network of reporters in both Africa and Asia. And she's a veteran foreign correspondent and has served for 15 years as a staff member of the World Health Organization in the Department of Public Health and Environment, where she's also dealt with gender aspects of health policy issues. So over to you, Elaine. Oh, Elaine, I think you're on mute now. If you.
Sorry, is that okay now? Can you see?
Yes, we can see you fine now. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for having me. And I want to start with a personal note that the fact that you've asked me to speak on International Women's Day is really about gender is something quite symbolic for me, because 4 years ago exactly, I got a big round of applause at WHO at an International Women's Day event where I spoke about the rights of older women in the organization. That was a very fleeting moment though of joy and victory, because 6 months later I was out of a job. And that was because of a new policy, or a policy that WHO adopted, delaying the mandatory retirement age to move to 65 years of age from the UN system, so that anybody aged 60 to 62, depending on when you were hired, was out of the system in 2018. It was a kind of house cleaning that occurred. It's a long story. I won't get into it too much here, except to say that one of the key arguments for that decision to buck the UN move to an older retirement age was gender equity. The theory went that since only 40% of WHO professionals worldwide at the time, age 60 to 62, were women, then clearing us out would make way for more younger women to be recruited to the organization. Of course, they didn't think about what that would mean for the older women that were already working in the organization. And 2 years later, looking back at the data again, and I looked at it quite carefully, I could see also that movement hadn't, in more gender equity, gender parity hadn't happened. Yes, there were some very visible high-level women who'd been hired in headquarters, and I think you've seen their names in the global health news, and they're doing an amazing job. I mean, it's really a great group of senior women. However, among the ranks and files of professionals, and particularly in the African region, the huge gender gaps remained. The mass retirement of this older cohort didn't really solve the much deeper, more systemic issues that bar younger women from getting jobs in some parts of the organization, or advancing through the higher professional ranks. And in fact, it took out a significant number of mid-ranking or even senior women who lost any chance to advance at all. For the cohort of women that I knew who were forced to retire in 2018, the results were difficult to say the least, and sometimes, in some cases, heartbreaking. There are some significant exceptions, but those were women who had worked for 25, 30 years in the organization. However, in a survey I helped do of the fellow staffers being free-tired, I'd call that fired and retired combination, most of those being forced to leave had only 5 to 15 years of tenure in the organization, while the average man had 15 to 25 years. So is it any surprise that women had a much harder time than men with this policy? I saw single mothers having to re-gear while they still had teenagers at home, a woman who had worked extremely hard to get a bachelor's degree while employed as an admin staff person, G staff, and then advanced into the lower professional ranks, was forced to sell her home. And many of these people wound up taking lower paying consultancies after their so-called retirements in order to keep afloat. This is obviously only the tip of the iceberg. The UN system is supposed to be set a gold standard, and we know that often salaries, especially in regions, are much higher than they might be for the average national staff worker or other workers in comparable industries in the countries, in the home countries where the UN and where the WHO are situated. And we also know that millions of women work worldwide in part-time work or in jobs in the informal sector. In fact, the informal sector is much more heavily dominated by women than by men, as far as I know from my last look at the ILO statistics. But my take home from this personal experience is that gender sensitive policies really need to be carefully designed to be age sensitive as well, and vice versa. And the mix of policies that would lead to greater gender equality may be different for women who are at entry level, in mid-career, and in later career stages. And I think we need to look across the life cycle when we're talking about gender issues to see how we can adapt and attune them. And this also has to, I think, keep age in mind for older women as well as for younger women. I think ageism cuts both ways. And that's something I learned as I was experiencing this myself. It can work against younger women as much as it works against older women, but that's for another discussion. In any case, of the survey that we did of the nearly 180 men and women who were being forced to retire early, 90% of those women viewed retirement as at age 60 or 62 as having negative impacts on their careers, pension, potential, and family mental health. There were also men affected, but as I noted, the impacts were just generally less severe because they had more seniority and more options in the system and outside of it. Many I saw were academics, for instance, who were able to return to university jobs, comfortable ones, after they left the organization. Also, as I'm reminded of a couple of points that were made by the previous speakers, as Menaka said, many of these women also felt that they couldn't be seen or heard. This also not included the cohort being retired, fired, left, told to leave early, was included administrative staff and women from around the world who did not have professional degrees and did not feel like they could protest effectively. And of course, this also deterred them and made them very, very fearful of taking any sort of legal recourse as well, which goes back to another point that was just made. The fact that older women felt more affected by the loss of their jobs in this one institution, and we're talking about privileged Geneva, is not really surprising when you think about it, because worldwide, women of my generation, and I'm 65 now, were among the first to enter the professional workforce in mass, I think in most countries. In the States, where I started my first job as a young reporter, we were supposed to wear these mock male suits. Some of you might recall them, with bow ties instead of long ties. It was sort of an imitation male attire. We didn't have older female models or guides. We had very crooked career paths, and that didn't always lead to the accumulation of big savings or pensions or other assets. So we had to improvise a lot. You know, I myself was mostly a freelancer while my children were young to accommodate my partner's career path. And given the fact that I was already professional in a very demanding profession, I saw this as a reasonable compromise that I should make. However, As a result, I only started to accumulate a pension around age 52, and then I got divorced. So I saw many of my peers struggling at midlife with these kinds of issues, but many also re-entered the workforce with a lot of vigor in our late 40s and 50s as our children grew older, and we were released from some of those other household tasks. I saw some peers taking more demanding jobs at distance from their homes. And in a certain sense, just as they were flourishing, the crisis of losing a job can be even greater, because you feel like you're just getting a foothold and rising to your career peak, and then you're suddenly cut short in flight, in mid-flight as it will. And also you feel that you may have advanced by merit, and yet all of a sudden age trumps merit. It also trumps gender. If you're supposed to have any advantage from your gender, then you learn that you are disadvantaged because you're supposed to, you're a penalty basically for other younger women entering the workforce, which is really a double sword, because it puts woman against woman in this kind of situation, in a false dichotomy, I think. I also saw, however, a very low level of understanding about these issues among other female peers. I can remember one very senior woman colleague, who's just 10 years younger than me, telling me that she supported the early retirement policies because we need to clear out the dead wood. And when I protested that this included me, she said it was my fault because I hadn't saved for a pension earlier and younger. Now, how many times have we heard in the course of gender discussions that it's your fault, that a woman is told it's her fault? I heard that, I think what I found in this whole experience is that ageism is sort of the last ism. While we all carry a greater sensitivity about gender, sexuality, race, religion, ethnic origins, there's that one ism still remains okay in the UN system, in other workplaces, and in societies at large. I don't know how much more time do I have. Can I just ask you so I don't?
You actually are just over time. So if you can bring it to a close, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I won't get into, I just want to say that there are more women living in poverty than men worldwide, older women. And this is certainly true in the States and Europe, where we've got good data. And in other countries, in other low and middle income countries, I think the trends could be even stronger because of the insecurity women face in the workforce. Just a couple silver linings in my personal story. I took over this small NGO, which was Age Blind, as editor-in-chief of Health Policy Watch. And as the head of this organization, I've been able to do some of the things I couldn't do in WHO, which is to try and better link up coverage of the global health policy debates in Geneva with realities on the ground in Africa and Asia. And this has involved fostering a global network of young journalists covering COVID, as well as a range of other critical health issues affecting women, from non-communicable diseases to health and climate. And it includes, not incidentally, a very heavy proportion of young women professionals, which I'm very happy to be mentoring today. But in terms of choices around childbearing, I think that women need more of the choice to choose their timing in terms of how they enter and exit the workplace. And I think there's creative.
Elaine, sorry, we're going to have to bring that to a close now.
Okay, just to say that I think there's creative solutions we can look at that would empower women as they age and look more at merit and at length of tenure in an organization instead of merely at your age and your gender, in terms of measures of how we continue in the workforce and how we can protectively contribute to society as we grow older. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you very, very much. Okay, so we have 15 minutes left, and I wondered if you'd like to ask any of the panelists a question, raise an issue. Please go ahead. If you can put your questions in the Q&A. I actually can't see any questions at the moment. I hope I'm... And if any of the panelists would like to ask anybody else a question, please feel free to do that. Oh, I think that Shireen has raised her hand, so please go ahead, Shireen.
Thank you so much. Gosh, there was so much covered there that I related to. It's hard to know where to start. I think I'm going to start with, is it Lucia? I'm going to start. Thank you so much for the experience that you bring, both personally and academically. And I really agree with you about the social construction of victims of violence in that kind of one-dimensional way that effectively, you know, creates this kind of picture of women that in itself is very oppressive. So I'm really pleased that you raised that. I'm also really pleased that you brought to light the various, how the response to people who are going through what they're going through in Ukraine, how that differs. I mean, you can't even, you could see clear daylight between how the victims of repression in Ukraine are treated versus the horrible, dehumanizing treatment that is given out to people who have escaped wars, walked literally through countries, then done this awful journey across seas to try and get to safety, that they are constructed as criminals. They're really dehumanized. There's just no comparison at all. And I don't want that to sound as though I begrudge the people of Ukraine, the humanitarian treatment they're getting, but why aren't all the people who are fleeing violence treated in that way? So that's one thing. I know that's a general point that doesn't just relate to women, but I was thinking back to, I'm from Sierra Leone, and I worked as a volunteer in a refugee camp during the Liberian Civil War. Even those women who had been subjected to violence in the Liberian Civil War couldn't talk about it, because in our cultures we don't talk about such intimate, you know, things. And rather than say I was raped, I was assaulted, they would say they had something to do with me. So the Western aid workers who were coming in didn't know what that meant and didn't have the cultural awareness to pursue that. They had something to do with me, and they were just, so even those women wouldn't get the help that they needed. Elaine, on your point, for me as somebody who turns 60 next year, who believes that there is life after 60, what advice would you give women like me who know that, for example, if we apply for jobs, they'll say, okay, we're not being ageist, you don't have to put your date of birth down on the form, but they will see when you went to school and automatically that's your application chucked to one side. How do we circumvent this discrimination that we know is real and that all women will face, because we are all aging every single day? Any ideas?
Well, you give me the chance to talk about a couple of the solutions that I wanted to mention. I'm sorry if I went over time. I think there's some in the formal sector and others that are more personal. Like on the personal level, I would say to women, get on LinkedIn. That's what I did, and just get out there, you know, just re-gear, reboot, and tell yourself, okay, you know, I'm gonna pretend I'm 30 and I'm gonna go after a job and I'm gonna get it, you know, that kind of thing. That's the personal level. On the systemic level, I think that we need to look a lot more at how to design age-sensitive pensions and retirement policies. And of course, again, this is recognizing that large parts of the world don't even have pensions, and that the informal sector is dominated by women. So we need to be talking a lot more about decent work and decent labor, thinking about what the ILO talks a lot about that, and picking up those things as gender issues. And also in terms of older people, giving women a little more time to work in the workforce. And this could be done simply by saying, okay, you get a pension after 25 years in the UN system, but you can't stay a day longer. I don't care if you're a man or a woman, because after 25 years, you're going to have enough for pension to live very comfortably, frankly, on a UN salary. And if you're a man, you've hit your 25, great, you're out. And if you're a woman and you still got 5 more years, even if you're 62 or 64, you can keep working. The presumption being that women that went in and out of the workforce for very good reasons often will go I did a lot of jobs where I wasn't looking to make a lot of money. And I did a lot of journalism jobs because I cared about them, you know, and often women we're motivated by our hearts and our passion, especially when we're younger. Why should we, you know, let us make up for that time? We have the energy, we have the time. So I think on the systemic level, we need to be looking at much more age-sensitive retirement policies, which give people a chance to retire and step back and change gears when they want to, but realize that women may need more of that time. And like in the Swiss system, I discovered after I left the WHO, I can't even accumulate a pension after age 62. I can't even accumulate Social Security. I'm not allowed to, I'm paying in, but I'm not allowed to add points because I'm supposed to have been retired. So, you know, there's all these, and I can't apply as a copy editor. I can't train. I can't get a credential as an editor in the UN system, even though I was an editor at WHO for 20 years or for 15 years because of the age limit is 55. So there's just tons and tons of barriers, as you mentioned, Charine, if you're looking at shifting jobs. And really women have to raise their voices. They have to fight. They have what Menaka said. And I think what Romina, the legal issues, women have to go out, and older women and fight and talk and speak and bring legal complaints when they can. And this is difficult because women are often fearful. They're even more fearful after 20 years or 30 years in the workforce. And it's hard to motivate. You've got to change the mindset around these issues.
Thanks very much. Penny, one of the participants has put a nice question, I think, in the question answers, is that on International Women's Day, what is the main message to the world? What do each of the panelists think? So I wondered maybe we could have a go around and you could each comment on what you think right now, taken the present context and what's happening, the main messages to the world is around International Women's Day. So, Romina, would you like to start?
Yeah, yes, only because I have to leave. Apologies for another meeting.
No problem, that's great.
It's a lovely question. I kind of thought about it while Elaine was speaking. I think what I guess my message would be that we should understand we have power within the communities we are part of, right? The community, our own communities. So I start with the church, right? I have an Eastern Orthodox background. I think it's the church responsibility to respond to domestic violence, gender inequality. So I think looking at our own communities, what we can do within our own positionalities, where we have an advantage, and really see ourselves as forces of change. And then the other thing is that we really need to look towards collaboration as opposed to division. We've been divided, the world is divided. And that's why I established this project Bridge. And I really think we need to serve more as mediators and bridges, as opposed to, you know, forces of division and controversy. And I know that's difficult sometimes to fight. You have to be controversial when you stand for what is right. But I think we also need to try and have more understanding amongst ourselves to really be able to collaborate and work together. Thank you so much. Lovely being here.
Thanks so much. And thank you again for your wonderful contribution on a really fascinating research and project. So thanks, Romina. Lucia, I wonder if you'd like to
yes, thank you.
Response to that.
My response was very similar to Romina's answer, actually, more so around positionality, like reflecting of how we situate ourselves in certain spaces. As women, we often, because we're already marginalized, it is even more difficult for us to have that empathy with other marginalized groups because we often center our own experiences at the forefront. So our positionality is an inherent aspect of understanding the lived experiences of others. So be more reflective of the spaces you occupy and what that contributes to certain conversations, and be more than just an active bystander, contribute to dismantling, deconstructing, decolonizing spaces wherever you are in your own capacity, and where of course your safety is also an important element, but make sure that you reflect on what you bring to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia. Menaka, would you like to just say what you think?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about it, but as a journalist, I would say that, it's important to write and research about women more than, what we think of them, the preconceived notions of what, the fixed positions that we have about certain kinds of women, and, go beyond that and, have more nuanced stories out about them, more than what, like, if I look at a poor woman, I mean, it's not like I have to expect that she's a certain way. We should, as researchers and journalists, and try to have a more complete picture about what people are like. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Elaine, any last thoughts about that from your side?
I guess my thought would be that gender always bites you back. I thought I'd escaped that issue or gotten beyond it, and then it came back, hit me in the face. And at the same time, I think equity and a fair playing field for everybody, men, women, regardless of age, regardless of ethnic and geographic background, that's really the aim here. And when we've got a fair playing field, everybody wins.
Thanks very much. I think there might be time for one more question, or we can bring things to a close. Okay, well, first of all, let me just say thank you so much to everybody to the speakers for their wonderful contributions. I mean, I found some of that really, really fascinating and incredibly insightful and interesting. And I mean, I think what struck me, and, for me, this is always the important thing, is, that old thing we used to talk about we used to talk about in the 80s, is the personal is political. And it just seemed to me that so much of the research and initiatives are so good at bringing together and understanding that. And I found that really, really so important and interesting. And I think the other thing for me that was just so important is that these different spaces that people are working in, there are these ways in which gender plays itself out, and the gendered inequalities that are part of those spaces, and just how important it is to grapple with those spaces. And there's a history there, a strongly colonial history in many contexts. There's all these things that come together, and I just found that really, really amazing in some of the presentations, how those. So thank you, all of you, for sharing and giving up your time. Thank you to the LIDC for bringing this together. It was a really wonderful initiative, because we probably all would have just got on with our work and not had this opportunity. So thanks, Shireen, and thanks to everybody for your contributions.
Thank you. Thank you. Onwards and upwards, sisters. International Women's Day. Let's have more progress to report on next year. For now, please keep in touch with us. We tweet at LIDC_UK. Our website is lidc.ac.uk. We're very grateful that we had this chance to hear from you today. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Bye.